Every border dispute you see in today's Middle East, every war fought over contested land, every refugee camp that has existed for 3 generations, and shows no sign of closing every religious conflict tearing a country apart from the inside, there is almost always a line you can trace backward through time. And if you follow that line far enough all the way back past the revolutions and the coups and the wars and the peace processes that failed before they even started, you end up in the same place every single time: the closed rooms of European imperial powers in the middle of a world war, where a handful of aristocrats, financiers, and career diplomats sat around a table and drew lines across a map of a region most of them had never personally visited. They drew those lines in a matter of weeks. The people living inside them are still dealing with the consequences more than 100 years later. They will be dealing with them for a long time still to come. The year was 1916. The world was drowning in the most catastrophic war it had ever produced. In the mudfields of France and Belgium, a generation of young men was being ground into the earth by industrial machinery designed specifically for mass killing. Empires were cracking under the strain. Governments were making promises they knew they could not keep because the pressure of survival demanded it. And while millions of men bled out in the trenches, the British and French governments were quietly carving up the Middle East between themselves. Before the war was even over, before a single inch of that territory had been formally captured, before any of the people actually living there had been consulted, informed, or even considered worth consulting. But this is not simply a story about imperialism. That version of events has been told before, and it leaves out the half of the story that explains the most. What has been examined far less often, and what matters just as much if you want to understand how this happened and why it still shapes the world today, is the financial dimension of the story. The banking dynasties, the oil interests, the invisible architecture of capital that made these territorial decisions not just possible, but functionally inevitable. Because behind every border drawn on that map, there was a balance sheet that somebody was reading very carefully. Behind every promise made and then broken, there was a transaction. Behind every diplomatic declaration that reshaped a region, there were financial interests that were about to benefit from the reshaping. And the men who held the most structural power in this story were not always the men whose names appear in history textbooks. Some of the most consequential figures operated through financial networks, through family connections, to governments, through the quiet and almost frictionless leverage that comes from being the institution a government turns to when it needs money in a crisis and cannot find it anywhere else. This is the story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the Rothschild family's extraordinary and deeply personal role in reshaping Palestine, the oil concessions that quietly drove British strategic decision-making at every turn, and the century of consequences that followed from all of it combined. It is a story about what happens when the world's most powerful financial interests collide with the oldest territorial claims on Earth, and when nobody in a position of power stops to ask the people who actually live on that land what they want, or whether they intend to accept what is being planned for them. To understand what happened in 1916, you need to go back much further than that. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had controlled the lands we now call Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and vast stretches beyond. At its height in the 17th century, the Ottoman state was among the most powerful and sophisticated political organisms on Earth, a sprawling multi-ethnic, multi-faith empire that stretched from the Balkans all the way down to the Arabian Peninsula, governing populations that spoke dozens of languages and practiced many religious traditions under a single administrative framework with genuine sophistication. But by the 19th century, the empire was rotting from within. Centuries of administrative corruption, a series of devastating military defeats, first against Russia, then against rising European powers across multiple theaters, economic stagnation driven by an inability to industrialize at the pace of European competitors, and the relentless competitive pressure of European colonialism had reduced this once formidable state to something that European diplomats mockingly called the sick man of Europe. The phrase contained both contempt and barely concealed appetite, because a sick man's possessions need to go somewhere when he finally dies. By the time the 20th century arrived, European powers were already circling the Ottoman territories with increasing urgency. France had taken Algeria in 1830, Tunisia in 1881, and was eyeing Syria with the focused intensity of a creditor who has finally run out of patience waiting for repayment on a debt. Britain controlled Egypt, administered the Suez Canal, the physical artery connecting Europe to its Indian Empire, and therefore one of the most strategically important waterways in the entire world, and was deeply and profitably invested in Persian Gulf trade routes that had been generating revenue for the empire for generations. Russia had its own ambitions pressing southward, including decades-old desires to control Constantinople and to gain unfettered access to the Mediterranean through the Black Sea Straits. Italy was making moves in Libya. Germany was building the Berlin to Baghdad Railway and staking out economic interests across the Ottoman interior. positioning itself as the great power most likely to inherit the most valuable pieces of the empire when it finally collapsed. But what none of these powers had yet fully reckoned with was something buried deep beneath the soil of this contested region, something that would prove to be the most consequential natural substance in the history of modern industrial civilization. Oil had been known to exist in parts of the Middle East for centuries, used as bitumen and pitch by ancient builders in Babylon and beyond. But it was not until the early 20th century that its full strategic significance began to register with urgency in the capitals of Europe. In 1901, a British entrepreneur named William Knox D'Arcy negotiated an extraordinary agreement with the Shah of Persia for the modest sum of £20,000 in cash, an equal value in company shares, and a promise of 16% of future profits. D'Arcy assumed the exclusive right to prospect for oil across most of the Persian landscape for 60 years. It was one of the most lopsided agreements in the history of natural resource extraction, the Shah receiving pocket change in exchange for rights to 6 decades of petroleum extraction across a vast country. D'Arcy hired geologists. He sank wells into the desert. For years, his men drilled and found almost nothing. His investors grew desperate. His personal resources were running low. His backers at Burma Oil finally sent word telling him to slow operations and pack up the equipment because the project was nearly over. The letter telling him to give up was making its way across the desert when at 4 a.m. on May 26, 1908, at a site called Masjid Soliman, a 50-foot gusher of petroleum exploded upward through the drilling rig and lit up the Persian night sky. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born from that precise moment, and with it, a political history that would consume the next century. The reason oil became so strategically important so quickly was the British Navy. In 1911, a young and exceptionally driven First Lord of the Admiralty named Winston Churchill had become convinced that Britain's naval supremacy, the single foundation upon which the entire British Empire rested, was at risk of being made obsolete. The Royal Navy ran entirely on coal. Coal-powered warships were slower, less powerful, and operationally more constrained than what modern oil-burning engines could deliver. Oil-powered ships could outrun coal-powered ships, outmaneuver them, and operate at far greater range without resupply. If Britain did not convert its fleet to oil, rival navies that did convert would eventually be able to run strategic circles around British ships. Churchill understood this with the certainty of a man who believed that naval dominance was not merely a national interest, but a civilizational necessity. The problem was starkly simple. Britain had almost no domestic oil supply whatsoever. It was entirely dependent on imports. And the two dominant forces in global oil were American Standard Oil, controlled through the vast network of companies that had emerged from the Rockefeller Empire, and the Dutch-controlled Royal Dutch Shell. Depending entirely on foreign commercial entities for the fuel that powered your military was not a position any serious imperial power could accept indefinitely. In 1913, Churchill stood before Parliament and told the House of Commons that Britain must become, at minimum, a controlling force at the very source of its oil supply. He pressed the case with characteristic intensity. 2 months before World War I officially began, the British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The Parliamentary Act authorizing the purchase received royal assent less than a week before the guns of August began to fire. This was not merely a financial investment. It was a declaration of strategic intent that would shape British foreign policy for the next 50 years and beyond. And the oil of Mesopotamia, the territory that would eventually become modern Iraq, was already on the radar of every serious player in the game. The geology of that region was practically identical to neighboring Persia, and reports from geologists and surveyors had been quietly indicating enormous potential reserves in the Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra for years. A shrewdly calculating Armenian oil broker named Kalusta Gulbenkian had written a detailed report for European investors as early as 1892, describing the immense petroleum deposits beneath Ottoman soil with a precision and confidence that impressed every serious reader. Gulbenkian was one of the most extraordinary figures of this entire era, a man who spent his entire career maneuvering across the competing interests of oil companies, governments, and empires with the patient skill of a chess grandmaster playing 20 games at once, always with an eye to securing for himself a permanent percentage of whatever deal was ultimately struck. By 1912, a consortium of British, Dutch, and German interests had formed a company specifically to pursue Mesopotamian petroleum, called the Turkish Petroleum Company. Anglo-Persian held 47.5%, Royal Dutch Shell held 22.5%, Deutsche Bank held 25%, and Gulbenkian personally held 5%, a stake he had negotiated into existence through years of arrangement and leverage, and that he would defend with extraordinary tenacity for decades. On June 28, 1914, the Ottoman Grand Vizier formally promised to grant the Turkish Petroleum Company a concession to develop oil in the Baghdad and Mosul regions. 4 days later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The world went to war. The Ottoman Empire joined Germany, and everything changed at once. Britain needed allies across the region if it was going to bring the Ottoman Empire down. It needed people with local knowledge, religious authority, and the ability to mobilize large populations against the Ottomans from the inside. So the British government, being strategically cynical in the way that great empires have always been, began making promises, several promises, to different parties about the same land, simultaneously. And this is where the story of 1916 becomes genuinely extraordinary in the scope of its duplicity. Because every promise was sincerely presented to its recipient as a firm commitment, and every promise was being quietly undermined before the ink was dry. The first promise went to the Arabs. Beginning in July 1915, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, entered into a secret correspondence with Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the most respected Islamic religious authority in the Arabian Peninsula, and one of the most politically significant figures in the Muslim world. The British needed the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire for a specific and urgent reason. The Ottoman Sultan had declared jihad against the Allies at the outset of the war, framing the conflict as a religious obligation for Muslims worldwide. This declaration threatened to ignite the 70 million Muslims living under British rule in India, potentially triggering an internal uprising that could destroy the empire from within at the exact moment it was fighting for its survival on the Western Front. The Sharif of Mecca was the one figure whose counter-declaration carried the religious weight to neutralize the Ottoman call to holy war. Over 10 letters exchanged between July 1915 and March 1916, McMahon effectively promised Hussein that Britain would recognize and support Arab independence across his sweeping territory, most of the Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. The language McMahon used was layered with deliberate vagueness and careful hedging, because he and his colleagues in London knew perfectly well they were making promises they were simultaneously planning to undermine. But Hussein read the correspondence as a genuine commitment. He decided to trust the British because the promises were detailed enough and specific enough that he believed they represented real British intent. An Arab revolt in exchange for an Arab state. That was the deal as Hussein understood it. Hussein launched the Arab revolt in June 1916. His son Faisal led Arab forces in a campaign that became romantically immortalized in Western memory through the involvement of the British officer T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, who worked alongside the Arab fighters, helped coordinate their operations with British military strategy, and built a close personal relationship with Faisal, grounded in genuine mutual respect and shared purpose. Arab forces captured Aqaba. They marched through some of the most punishing desert terrain on earth under conditions of brutal hardship. They tied down Ottoman divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the Turkish fronts against British forces in Palestine and Mesopotamia. They sabotaged railway lines. They ambushed supply convoys. They fought their way into Damascus in the final weeks of the war, believing that their arrival in Syria was the first step toward the independent Arab state they had been promised. Thousands of men died for that belief. Thousands more were wounded, imprisoned, or displaced. The families of the Hejaz committed everything they had to the Allied cause because they trusted the letters from the British commissioner and believed the promises were real. They were deceived from the very beginning, because at the exact same moment the Arabs were mobilizing in the desert, a pair of diplomats in London were constructing an arrangement that would render the promised Arab state meaningless. Negotiations had begun in November 1915. On the British side was Sir Mark Sykes, a conservative member of Parliament with some experience of Middle Eastern travel and a gift for confident assertion that was not always matched by deep understanding. On the French side was François-Georges Picot, a career diplomat who had served as French consul in Beirut, who came from a prominent family with deep personal ties to the French colonial project in Syria, and who represented a French determination to control the Levant that predated the war and would survive it. Over several months of negotiation, Sykes and Picot worked out the terms of a secret arrangement. On May 16, 1916, while the Arab revolt was already underway, while Arab fighters were dying in the desert on the strength of British promises, the agreement was ratified in an exchange of letters with Russian assent secured separately. France would take Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take Iraq and Palestine. The remaining Arab territories would be organized into nominally independent states that were in practice zones of European influence, with British and French advisors embedded in their governments. The Ottoman Empire would be carved up and distributed among the victors, regardless of what the populations inside it wanted or had been told to expect. The map that Sykes drew to illustrate the arrangement was famously crude. He later claimed to have simply drawn a line from the letter E in acre on the Mediterranean coast to the last K in Kirkuk in the north. Borders that would determine the political existence of millions of people for generations were sketched with reference to the typography of city names on a map. The line cut through communities that had coexisted for centuries. It separated tribes from their seasonal grazing lands, merchants from the cities they supplied, families from the villages of their relatives. None of this was treated as a serious obstacle. And then, before the Sykes-Picot ink was even metaphorically dry, Britain made a third promise, to a different group entirely, about the same territory. By late 1917, the war had ground on far longer and far more destructively than any government had imagined when they first mobilized in the summer of 1914. Britain was exhausted financially, physically, and politically. France was hemorrhaging at the front. Russia was in revolutionary chaos, with the Bolsheviks seizing power and immediately beginning to negotiate a separate peace with Germany. America had entered the war, but had not yet suffered casualties at any scale that would fully commit American public opinion to the Allied cause. The mood in London under Prime Minister David Lloyd George was verging on desperation, and the government was searching urgently for anything that could shift the balance. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour wrote to one man in particular, not to a head of state, not to a military commander, but to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, the second Baron Rothschild, the unofficial leader of the British Jewish community. The letter, 67 words, stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, with the understanding that nothing would be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the political status of Jews in other countries. To understand why this letter was addressed to a Rothschild, and why that choice meant what it meant, you need to understand the Rothschild family's relationship with Palestine, a relationship that had been building and deepening for decades before this letter was written, and that represents one of the most remarkable intersections of financial power, ideological conviction, and geopolitical calculation in modern history. The Rothschild banking dynasty had, by 1917, been the dominant private financial network in Europe for well over a century. The family's story, from Mayer Amschel Rothschild in the Frankfurt ghetto to 5 brothers in 5 European capitals, managing the flows of capital that financed wars, stabilized governments, and determined the creditworthiness of nations, is a story that fundamentally changed what private banking could be and do in the modern world. The Rothschilds created the first truly transnational bank, the first institution that could move money reliably across borders at the speed of a diplomatic courier, providing liquidity to governments at exactly the moments when governments most desperately needed it. Nathan Rothschild in London had made the family Eze British branch the most important private financial institution in the country. His descendants maintained that position through the 19th century, lending to governments, managing bond issues, and acquiring stakes in major industries, including oil and mining. The family held large positions in Royal Dutch Shell, one of the principal oil companies of the early 20th century, and major stakes in Rio Tinto and other extractive enterprises embedded in the financial architecture of empire. But one member of the French branch had made it his life's work to do something that went beyond banking entirely. Baron Edmund James de Rothschild was the youngest son of the founder of the French branch. Born in 1845, raised in the palaces of Second Empire Paris, heir to an enormous personal fortune that he could have spent in any number of comfortable ways. Instead, in 1882, at 37 years of age, he began quietly directing substantial amounts of his personal wealth toward a project that most people around him considered either quixotic or impossible: the physical resettlement of Jewish communities in Ottoman Palestine. The immediate context that moved him was the wave of devastating pogroms sweeping through Russia in 1881 and 1882, organized violence against Jewish communities that drove tens of thousands of people into desperate flight. The question of where Jewish refugees could find permanent safety was pressing and immediate, and a movement had been growing for years, arguing that the only lasting solution was a Jewish homeland, a physical territory where Jewish people could exist without depending on the tolerance and goodwill of host governments that had consistently failed them whenever political conditions turned hostile. Palestine, the ancient homeland of Jewish civilization, was the destination most central to that movement's vision, even though it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire and had a large existing Arab population. Edmund de Rothschild did not wait for any political solution to materialize. He began financing settlements directly, starting with a community called Rishon LeZion, the first in Zion. In 1882, he funded Petah Tikva, then Zikron Yaakov, named after his father, then Rosh Pinah in the Galilee, then Metula at the Lebanese border. He covered the construction of houses, roads, wineries, glass factories, silk production facilities, schools, and synagogues. He brought in French agricultural experts to teach settlers modern farming techniques adapted to the Mediterranean climate. He paid for extensive irrigation systems designed to make dry land productive. He hired networks of administrators throughout Palestine who reported to him in exhaustive detail about the daily operations of every settlement he had funded, and he reviewed those reports with an intensity that became legendary among the settlers themselves. They said Rothschild knew when every goat gave birth in the colonies he supported. Such was the granularity of his attention to what he had built. Over the course of 50 years, Edmund de Rothschild spent an estimated $6 million of his personal fortune on Jewish settlement in Palestine. To get a sense of what that meant in terms of scale, consider that this was an era when a modest house cost a few $100s, when annual agricultural wages for a laborer were measured in dozens of dollars per year. $6 million from one man's private account over 5 decades, translated into an infrastructure of settlements, agricultural enterprises, industrial investments, and economic institutions that had no parallel anywhere else in the region. By 1918, Rothschild-associated landholdings covered roughly 1/20th of Palestine's fertile territory. All not because it had been conquered or seized, but because it had been purchased through Rothschild-funded organizations, buying land from Ottoman landowners and from local Arab proprietors, transaction by transaction, over 4 decades of patient accumulation. In 1924, Edmund formally organized his Palestinian investments under the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, known as PICA, which went on to acquire more than 125,000 acres and help establish over 40 settlements. PICA became the largest single Jewish landowner in Mandatory Palestine, developing the Palestine Electric Company, funding a potash works on the Dead Sea, building cement factories, and establishing the agricultural and industrial skeleton of what would eventually become an independent economy. The map of modern Israel is, in a very direct and literal sense, partly a map of Rothschild investment. The Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv is named for him. The cities of Binyamina and Givat Ada, Pardes Hana and Zichron Yaakov, all named for members of his family, built with his capital, shaped by decisions made in his offices. This was not symbolic or ceremonial. It was the physical expression of one family's 50-year commitment to a particular vision of the future, translated into settlements and roads and wells and vineyards and factories that, by the time of the Balfour Declaration, constituted a significant and irreversible economic presence on the ground. So when Balfour sat down to address his letter, he chose the Rothschild name for reasons that went far beyond ceremony. Walter Rothschild was a prominent Zionist, a personal friend of Chaim Weizmann, the most effective Zionist advocate operating in British political circles, and the head of an organization, the English Zionist Federation, that had been lobbying the British government for precisely this kind of declaration for years. But above all, the Rothschild name itself carried a weight in Jewish communities around the world that no other name could match. If you wanted to signal to Jewish communities in New York, in Petrograd, in Berlin, in Warsaw, communities whose political and financial support Britain was actively courting, that Britain was seriously committed to the Zionist project, there was no more powerful way to do it than to address your letter to a member of the Rothschild family. Why did Britain want to make this declaration at all? Here is where the strategic machinery becomes starkly visible beneath the surface of the idealism. By late 1917, Britain needed the United States fully committed to the war effort, not just militarily, but financially and politically. American Jewish communities were politically active and socially influential in ways that British officials believed, perhaps somewhat simplistically, could be mobilized through a declaration of British support for Zionism. A supportive gesture toward Jewish national aspirations might generate goodwill that translated into political pressure for American engagement. Second, Russia's revolutionary chaos was threatening to pull the country out of the Allied coalition entirely, freeing up enormous German forces for transfer to the Western Front. Jewish communities in Russia were perceived as a potential political constituency whose sympathy might help keep Russia in the fight. The declaration was designed to win Jewish opinion in both countries at once. The Rothschild Archive itself records explicitly that, beginning in 1916, the British government was actively calculating that, in exchange for supporting Zionism, Jewish financial networks would help meet the catastrophically growing costs of the war. This was not speculation or retrospective interpretation. It was documented British government thinking, a recorded calculation about the relationship between political commitments and expected financial support. The declaration was, among many other things, a transaction. Diplomatic support for Zionist goals in exchange for the expectation of financial and political backing from Jewish communities and institutions worldwide. There was also a purely geographic calculation that had nothing to do with Zionism at all. Palestine sat on the eastern flank of the Suez Canal, the most strategically critical waterway in the British Empire. Whoever controlled Palestine controlled the approaches to Egypt and the canal route to India. A British mandate over Palestine, given international legitimacy through a commitment to facilitating Jewish settlement, would cement British strategic dominance over that corridor permanently. Balfour and Lloyd George were, among many other things, thinking about the route to India and the security of the canal. And so, within roughly 2 years, Britain had promised the Arabs a state, promised France a sphere of influence across the same territory, and promised Jewish communities a national home in a portion of that same land, all while concealing each set of promises from the other parties, and all while privately planning to maintain British strategic and economic dominance over the entire region, regardless of how the competing promises resolved. Each promise was made with urgency, with apparent sincerity, and with the calculation that when the war ended, there would be time to sort out the contradictions. There was not. Beneath all of this, running like an underground river through every diplomatic decision, was the oil question. As the war progressed and Ottoman defeat became increasingly likely, British strategic thinking became increasingly obsessed with one calculation: who would control Mesopotamia as petroleum when the empire finally fell? In 1918, Balfour himself, the same man who wrote the Declaration, addressed the prime ministers of the British dominions on the subject of the Middle East. He told them directly that Britain must be the guiding spirit in Mesopotamia, and he said explicitly that the reason was oil. He stated that he did not care under what political system Britain kept access to the oil, but that it was entirely clear the oil needed to be available to Britain. The British Foreign Secretary, the author of the Declaration promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, was simultaneously making clear that Mesopotamian petroleum was the primary consideration in British Middle Eastern strategy. British forces in the final weeks of the war were operating under oil-related instructions that translated directly into territorial action. The armistice with the Ottoman Empire was signed on October 30th, 1918. British forces entered the city of Mosul in northern Mesopotamia, at the center of the most promising oil territory in the region, on November 14, 1918. 3 days after the armistice with Germany had formally ended the war, they captured Mosul after the shooting had officially stopped, moving into territory that the Sykes-Picot Agreement had assigned to the French sphere of influence. This was not military confusion or a miscommunication about armistice terms. It was a deliberate act of territorial appropriation, an attempt to establish physical facts on the ground before any post-war peace conference could enforce the existing negotiated boundaries. The British were betting that possession would prove 9/10 of the diplomatic argument, and they were right. When the formal post-war settlement was worked out at the San Remo Conference in April 1920, a gathering of Allied powers at a villa on the Italian Riviera, attended by the prime ministers of Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, the Mosul question was resolved through a direct financial trade. France agreed to cede Mosul to the British mandate over Iraq. In exchange, Britain gave France a 25% share in the successor company that would develop Mosul's oil. The conference even produced a separate San Remo oil agreement on April 24, 1920, signed the same day as the territorial mandates. This is not an analogy or a metaphor. The same conference, on the same day, formalized both the territorial borders of mandated Iraq and the oil company shareholding arrangement for Iraqi petroleum. The two decisions were explicitly connected. The territorial concession was the price paid for the commercial share. The borders of modern Iraq were drawn in significant part as the result of an oil company equity negotiation. This is documented history. Mosul became part of Iraq because France received a 25% stake in the entity that would extract Mosul's oil. Meanwhile, the American oil companies, watching all of this unfold from across the Atlantic, were furious at their exclusion. The United States government began arguing loudly that the existing concession arrangement from the defunct Ottoman Empire was legally invalid, and that Mesopotamian oil should be open to international competition. Congress passed legislation threatening retaliation against foreign companies whose governments discriminated against American oil interests. It took years of sustained diplomatic pressure, but by 1928, an American consortium was finally admitted to the company, which by then had renamed itself the Iraq Petroleum Company. The final arrangement in 1928 gave 23.75% each to Anglo-Persian, Royal Dutch Shell, Compagnie Française des Pétroles, and an American consortium. Gulbenkian retained his 5%, a stake that had made him one of the richest private individuals on earth, the product of 4 decades of extraordinarily patient maneuvering. And the entire arrangement came with a condition that would govern Middle Eastern oil development for 20 years. All partners agreed that none of them would independently pursue oil concessions anywhere within the former boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, without offering the other partners the right to participate. Gulbenkian drew the boundary line of this restricted zone himself, using a red crayon on a map tracing the old Ottoman borders. The arrangement became known as the Red Line Agreement, and it was not publicly disclosed. Ordinary people in Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and the rest of the region, living above and beside this oil, had no idea that the resources beneath their land were being quietly managed by a secret cartel of European and American corporations who had agreed among themselves to control the pace of development. The agreement specifically allowed the partners to suppress production in Iraq whenever increasing output would drive down their prices in other global markets. The people of Iraq received royalties that amounted to a fraction of the value being extracted from the ground beneath them, because the concession terms had been designed by the extractors, not by the extracted. Royal Dutch Shell, in which the Rothschild family held major stakes throughout this period, was one of the principal partners in the Iraq Petroleum Company. This placed the Rothschild family in the position of having significant financial interests in the resolution of both major questions in the region simultaneously. A British mandate over Palestine that protected Jewish settlement enhanced the value of 50 years of Rothschild investment in Palestinian land and infrastructure, and access to Mesopotamian oil through the companies in which the family held equity stakes gave them a return from the territorial arrangements being made in Iraq. The same family whose member had received the Balfour Declaration as a letter addressed to him personally also held shares in the oil companies that the mandate system in Iraq was designed to benefit. These connections were not conspiratorial, they were structural, the natural result of a family that had spent a century positioning itself at the intersection of capital, government, and empire. The moment when the elaborate architecture of competing promises finally buckled under its own weight came not from any British or French action, but from revolutionary Russia. When the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917, they raided the Tsarist archives and found the secret treaties. On November 23, 1917, the Soviet government published the full text of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Russian newspapers Izvestia and Pravda. Within days, the Manchester Guardian had reprinted the documents in English. The world now knew what had been arranged in secret. Arab leaders who had been fighting alongside British forces, committing to the Allied cause on the explicit understanding that their sacrifice would be rewarded with sovereignty, learned that their patrons had been planning to divide their land between France and Britain from the very beginning. Faisal, Hussein's son, who was commanding Arab forces in the field at the moment the documents were published, read the Sykes-Picot text with a devastation that cannot be adequately described. He had taken the British at their word. He had staked the Arab revolt on those words. He had led men into the desert to die for a promise that, as he could now read in precise diplomatic language, was never seriously intended to be kept. T.E. Lawrence, who had known about the Sykes-Picot Agreement while working alongside the Arab fighters and presenting to them a vision of their coming liberation, later wrote about the experience with visible and acute personal anguish. He described himself, in his own words, as a fraud, a man who had made promises to people who trusted him on behalf of a government that had no intention of honoring them. He wrote that he had been in an impossible position, telling men who were dying for freedom that their sacrifice would be rewarded while carrying in his own head the knowledge that the political architects in London had already allocated their land to other powers. The McMahon-Hussein letters, the actual correspondence that formed the basis of the promise to the Arabs, were kept classified by the British government for over 20 years, not released publicly until 1939. The British suppressed those documents specifically because releasing them earlier would have made Britain as diplomatic conduct during the war impossible to defend. When a senior British parliamentarian finally commented on the record after the release, he said simply that Britain had certainly meant what it said in 1915 and had certainly not done what it said in 1918. In April 1920, at San Remo, the post-war settlement was formalized. Britain received the mandate over Palestine and Iraq. France received Syria and Lebanon. The Balfour Declaration's language was explicitly incorporated into the terms of the Palestine Mandate, making the commitment to Jewish settlement a matter of international law ratified by the League of Nations, and the populations who had been promised something entirely different were left to confront the new reality however they could. In Syria, where Faisal had established an Arab government in Damascus, believing that his father, his understanding with the British would be honored, France arrived with an army. At the Battle of Maysalun in July 1920, French forces crushed the Arab Syrian army in a matter of hours. Faisal was expelled from the country he had fought to liberate. The Arab Kingdom of Syria, which had held elections, established ministries, and begun the institutional life of an independent state, lasted less than 2 years before being destroyed by French military force. The French then proceeded to subdivide their Syrian mandate into smaller units, an Alawite state, a Druze state, a Greater Lebanon, in a deliberate administrative strategy designed to prevent unified Arab nationalism from crystallizing into an effective political force. Lebanon's extraordinary communal complexity today, which has produced one full civil war and many severe political crises since independence, is in large part the product of French administrative decisions made in the 1920s, specifically to fracture the country along religious lines, in the interest of maintaining French control. The Kurds, who had been promised an autonomous homeland under the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, watched as that promise was quietly erased when the Treaty of Lausanne replaced Sèvres in 1923. Turkish nationalist pressure, combined with the broader calculation of the colonial powers that a unified and cooperative Turkey was more strategically useful than a treaty-compliant Turkey with autonomous Kurdish regions, simply removed the commitment from the framework of international law. Nobody in London or Paris argued very hard for the Kurds. There was nothing in Kurdish territory at that moment that the great powers needed badly enough to fight over. The Kurds were left stateless, a people of 30 to 40 million, one of the largest ethnic groups on earth without a country of their own. They have been fighting for recognition in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran ever since, at an enormous and ongoing cost in lives, imprisonment, displacement, and suffering. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and its consequences are cited by Kurdish political leaders and intellectuals to this day as the foundational act of injustice that defines their political situation. Iraq was assembled from 3 former Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, that had no shared political tradition, whose populations were divided between Sunni Arabs in the center and west, Shia Arabs in the south, and Kurds in the north, and whose borders were drawn primarily to ensure British access to oil and trade routes. The Hashemite Prince Faisal, expelled from Syria, was installed as King of Iraq by the British in 1921, essentially parachuted into a country he had never previously lived in, to govern people who had not asked for him, under a constitution designed by British High Commissioner Percy Cox to maintain British strategic influence while providing the appearance of Arab self-determination. The sectarian divisions between Sunni and Shia Arabs, and between Arabs and Kurds, that continue to define Iraqi politics to this day are not simply ancient religious hatreds that have persisted unchanged since the dawn of Islam. They were institutionalized and deliberately exploited by the British mandate system, which managed these communities against each other as a governance strategy, the oldest instrument of colonial rule. Palestine was placed under direct British administration. Jewish immigration, backed by Rothschild-funded organizations, and the expanding institutional machinery of the Zionist movement, continued and accelerated through the 1920s and 1930s. Pika went on to develop the Palestine Electric Company, a Dead Sea potash works, cement factories, and dozens of agricultural settlements that transformed the country's landscape. Meanwhile, the Arab population of Palestine, who in 1917 made up roughly 90% of the total population, had not been consulted at any stage of the negotiations that determined their future. Balfour himself acknowledged this with a candor that is almost stunning in retrospect. In a private 1919 memorandum, he wrote that in Palestine, the Western powers did not intend to go through even the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants, and that Zionism was of more profound importance than the desires and interests of the roughly 700,000 Arabs living there. That statement, written by the author of the Declaration itself, is as clear a window into the governing moral framework as you will find anywhere in the historical record. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, 3 years of widespread armed uprising against British rule, and accelerating Jewish immigration, was brutally suppressed by British forces, leaving Arab-Palestinian political and military leadership decimated at precisely the moment it needed to be strongest. When the decisive confrontation of 1948 came, the Palestinian Arab population was fighting from a position of profound organizational weakness that was directly the product of what they had suffered under British mandate rule. The creation of the State of Israel in May 1948 was the moment when all the competing promises of 1915 to 1920 finally resolved into a single catastrophic event. The First Arab-Israeli War drove roughly 700,000 Palestinian Arabs from their homes, a displacement that Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, and that has shaped Palestinian identity and political consciousness in every subsequent generation. Many of those refugees and their descendants remain in camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria to this day, representing one of the longest-running unresolved refugee crises in modern history. The oil architecture put in place in the 1920s enriched the companies and governments that had maneuvered to control the concessions for decades. Anglo-Persian became Anglo-Iranian, then British Petroleum, then BP, still one of the largest corporations in the world. The American companies that joined the Iraq Petroleum Company eventually secured the Saudi Arabian concession through Aramco, which became the foundational asset of ExxonMobil's presence in the Gulf. The Red Line Agreement suppressed Iraqi oil development for years, maintaining artificial scarcity, and elevated global prices in the interests of shareholders, until American pressure after World War II finally broke the cartel apart. Iraq's oil was nationalized in 1972 when the Iraqi government reclaimed what had been taken from the country by concession arrangements made 50 years earlier. The populations of Iraq received royalties that amounted to a fraction of the actual value extracted from their land for most of the 20th century because the concession terms were designed from the outset by the extractors in their own interests. When the Islamic State declared its caliphate in 2014 and destroyed the border crossing between Iraq and Syria as a symbolic rejection of Sykes-Picot, that gesture resonated across the region in a way that the group's purely territorial ambitions never could. Whatever the Islamic State was, and its record of mass murder, enslavement, and cultural destruction, is unambiguous and historically documented, the particular act of declaring Sykes-Picot dead named a real grievance that millions of people across the Arab world had felt for a century. The borders were drawn for European interests. That is not contested by anyone who has read the history. The question is what to do about it now, when those borders have become the organizing principle of states, economies, armies, and identities that have their own weight and their own momentum. The Rothschild family's legacy in this story resists simple moral summary, and any honest account has to resist the temptation to reduce it to either heroism or villainy. Baron Edmunds' 50 years of personal investment in Palestine materially and decisively contributed to the existence of the State of Israel, and for Jewish communities that had survived centuries of persecution in Europe and that faced the Holocaust within 20 years of the Balfour Declaration. That state represents survival and dignity of the most fundamental kind. For Palestinian families who lost their homes, their land, and their futures in 1948 and in the decades since, the same sequence of events represents what they rightfully call catastrophe. Both things are true simultaneously, and no honest account can resolve the tension between them by choosing one side and ignoring the other. What the story of the years from 1915 to 1922 ultimately teaches, if you are willing to follow its full implications all the way to where they lead, is something about the permanent and invisible relationship between financial capital and the maps of the world. The men who drew those lines were not simply diplomats or military strategists or ideologues. They were embedded in systems of financial interest in which their decisions about territory were functionally inseparable from their interests, in what lay beneath it, above it, and on either side of it. They promised the Arabs a state because they needed Arab fighters. They promised the Jews a homeland partly from genuine ideological conviction, and partly because they needed Zionist financial and political networks to sustain the war effort. They drew borders for France and Britain not because those borders reflected any geographic, cultural, or human reality, but because they corresponded to oil concessions and naval routes and strategic corridors that the powers involved had decided they needed to control. The people on the ground, the Arab farmers, the Kurdish tribes, the Palestinian villagers, the Jewish settlers building something new in complex circumstances, were never the primary consideration. They were the raw material from which the architecture of power was constructed, and the financial networks that made the whole construction possible, that connected banking dynasties to government ministers, that linked oil concessions to territorial mandates, that tied settlement investment to diplomatic declarations, remained largely invisible, operating through social connections, through board memberships, through the simple fact that the people making decisions about the Middle East were, many of them, the same people who had financial interests in how those decisions came out. History does not stay in the past. It flows forward through institutions, through borders, through debts, financial debts and moral debts alike, and through the accumulated weight of decisions made by people who are long dead but whose choices are still shaping the lives of millions of people who had no say in them. The lines drawn in 1916 are still drawing blood. The promises made and broken between 1915 and 1920 are still generating the grievances that fuel contemporary violence and political instability. The oil concession structures of the 1920s created the economic relationships and political dependencies that still govern how the Gulf states engage with Western governments and corporations today. The Middle East, you see in Today, his headlines, is the Middle East that was manufactured in those rooms, by those men, for those interests. The suffering that continues there is not the result of ancient hatreds that erupted spontaneously. It is the result of decisions made by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who understood that the promises they were making were contradictory, and who calculated that by the time the contradictions became impossible to manage, they would be in a strong enough position to manage them anyway. They were wrong about the last part. But by the time that became clear, the damage was done, the map was drawn, and the people living inside it were left to figure out how to survive it. If understanding that changes how you read what is happening there now, how you watch the news, how you think about who bears responsibility for what,